I'm here at Flamborough Head on the East Yorkshire coast, a place where smugglers used to sneak ashore in the dead of the night to distribute their illegal wares. What wares, you ask? Antiques, drugs, gold? How about tea? You see, Britain's favourite drink has quite a history behind it. One could even argue that few products in existence have been tied to more death, destruction, or misery. It sounds far-fetched, but trust me, by the end of this video, you'll never look at a cup of tea the same way again. So Britain drinks around 100 million cups of tea every single day. That breaks down to around 570 cups per year per adult, or enough to fill 2 bathtubs. The one I'm making right now, I think, is probably about 850 this year for me already. For most of us, drinking tea is a ritual, and we do it because we're British and that's just what we do. But why? After all, tea isn't native to our islands. Sure, you can find a few small farms in Cornwall and Scotland, but to satisfy our multi-bathtub level addiction, we rely on massive plantations in India, Kenya and Sri Lanka. In 2024, the UK imported approximately 113,000 tonnes of tea at a cost of around £295 million. So how did tea become something so iconically British when it's about as local as bamboo? Well, to answer that question, we need to visit 17th century Portugal. In 1662, a young Portuguese princess named Catherine of Braganza found herself betrothed to King Charles II of England. Now, she'd never met Charles, which was pretty standard at the time, but when she arrived in Portsmouth, home of the best football team on the south coast, her first concern wasn't an introduction to her soon-to-be husband. It was, of course, a cup of tea. Unfortunately, she might as well have been asking for something no one's ever heard of, because apart from a few coffee houses in London, almost nobody had. So they gave her a pint, a proper British welcome. Unsatisfied with her new home's beverage selection, Catherine began having care packages of tea sent from home. As the new queen, her tea addiction quickly became the subject of fascination and laser emulation. At the royal court, she made drinking tea into a performance with daily ceremonies, expensive porcelain and exclusive tea parties with her fellow nobles. It was only a matter of time before other aristocrats were doing the same. So while she didn't technically introduce tea to Britain, she did make it fashionable. If she was alive today, she would be an influencer promoting 20-pound bars of Dubai chocolate. But there's yet a lot more to the story, because before tea could become the official drink of Britain, it had to overcome one little problem. Nobody who wasn't ultra rich could afford it. Fortunately, there's always a solution. It's crime. Crime is the solution. If you were your average non-noble British citizen, you desperately wanted to partake in your Queen's new hobby. But at the time, tea cost more than people earned in a month. Here's how it worked. At night, ships from France and Holland would anchor just offshore in total darkness. Smugglers would row their smaller boats out to meet them, load up the crates of untaxed tea and row back in complete silence. Then they'd hide the tea in the interconnected caves all along the coast. People at places like Robin Hood's Bay, just down the coast here, used to say there was so much tea packed in these caves that you could literally smell it on the wind when you walked down by the strand. Next, the smugglers would move the caffeinated contraband into other hiding places. Their favourite spots were barns, private houses, and local businesses. Oh, and yeah, churches. It seems there was no shortage of local vicars on the payroll. By the 1780s, millions of pounds of tea were being smuggled into Britain every year, rivaling or even exceeding legal imports. That said, like most black market products, there were risks to consuming non-sanctioned tea. For instance, many criminals used to collect used tea leaves called slop, dry them out and then resell them. This meant thousands of people were using second-hand tea, but they probably just thought it was PG tips. Other tricks for boosting profits included filling out the tea with cheaper leaves from hawthorn, beech or willow trees, and that's if you were lucky. Less savvy smugglers would stoop even lower, using brick dust, chalk or ash. It was a lucrative, if dishonest trade, at least for a while. In 1784, Prime Minister William Pitt cut the tea duty from 119 to 12.5%. Overnight, legal tea became affordable and smuggling literally collapsed. Problem solved? Well, not quite. Just because it was affordable doesn't mean that sourcing tea became any easier. At the time, virtually every single leaf that ended up on a British table came from China. This necessitated the development of a highly sophisticated system of trade in which tea was exchanged for silver. It worked for a while, but by the mid-1700s, Britain's silver reserves were running very low. In its desire to keep the green gold flowing, the British devised a two-part solution. First, they would get more silver back by finding something to sell to the Chinese. Secondly, they would learn to grow their own tea. Trade ministers scoured the empire to find something the Chinese would be willing to pay for. Eventually, somebody decided that they might enjoy this plant that had been growing in British-ruled India. The plant was opium. So yes, the British deliberately fostered over 100 years of widespread drug addiction in order to finance the tea trade. Merchants in the East India Company provided opium for silver, which they then used to buy more tea. This created an effective loop while the empire set up its own tea plantations in India, Sri Lanka and Kenya. While British tea drinkers and merchants were happy, the suffering amongst Chinese families was immense. The addiction eventually got so bad and widespread that China even went to war twice to stop the opium from coming in. But after tens of thousands of deaths and years of fighting, China lost. Under the Treaty of Nanking, Hong Kong was given to Britain and the Chinese were forced to accept the continued flow of opium. If you think that's as bad as it gets, strap in. Once the tea plantations were up and running, the cost of tea took another nosedive. Suddenly, it was no longer a luxury item, but an everyday essential. But even though tea was cheap enough to bathe in, Brits still had a big problem with their budding national beverage. It was too bitter. Luckily, adding sugar made it a lot tastier and better. You probably know where this is going. From the late 17th century to the early 19th century, millions of Africans were taken from their homeland, enslaved and forced to work on Caribbean sugar plantations in places like Barbados, Jamaica and Trinidad. This created what was known as the Triangle of Trade. Ships left British ports loaded with textiles, weapons and manufactured goods, which they traded for slaves. These were then brought to the Americas where they helped harvest sugarcane. That sugar sweetened Britain's tea and helped ensure a steady flow of cakes and biscuits to accompany tea time. The profits from selling it, meanwhile, helped to further expand the British Empire. To give you an idea of how big this business was, in 1800 Britain was importing around 300,000 tonnes of sugar a year and over 20 million pounds of tea. And so the world's most civilised drink became inexorably tied to one of the worst crimes against humanity ever committed. So tea is now cheap and in demand across the British Isles. But how did it become so woven into the fabric of our culture? By the 1800s, Britain's cities were packed with factories. Following the natural flow of jobs, millions of people relocated into crowded tenement housing across London, Manchester and Birmingham. Smoke filled the air, rivers ran grey with chemical waste and sanitation systems were primitive to say the least. Cholera and typhoid were constant risks and infection meant almost certain death. But tea requires water to be boiled, so while the people didn't even know what germs were, they were unsuspectingly saving themselves from outbreaks by doing nothing more than having a cuppa every few hours. Eventually, people realised that those who drank more tea were less likely to get sick, helping the tradition evolve into a necessity. All those millions of poor industrial workers soon found that tea gave them a nice lift to get through their grueling 12-hour shifts. In fact, by adding milk and sugar, they could increase the beverage's calorie count and enjoy even more energy. Employers, noticing how the tea drinkers performed better, started normalising tea breaks to maximise productivity. By the late 1800s, tea had gone from a phenomenon to an integral part of daily life. It was so ubiquitous that it became an integral part of both individual and British identity. Hundreds of years later, you still get into a fight over whether you should add the milk first or last. To defend tea is to defend your very Britishness.
Britain, Britain, Britain.
Fashion made it desirable, smugglers made it affordable, and the expansion of the empire made it abundant. Later, slavery made it sweet, and the Industrial Revolution made it essential. Like it or not, every cup of tea you drink carries that history, from the rituals set forth by Catherine of Braganza to the violence caused by the opium and sugar trades. Try as we might, it's impossible to separate Britain's drink from British history. So while the kids may claim to prefer Starbucks, you can still walk into any home, office or building in Britain and find someone making tea. 100 million cups a day, and it's not likely to change anytime soon. The perfect cuppa. Cheers, and I'll see you on the next one.